The night air outside the Whitmore estate carried an unnatural weight, heavy with the scent of rain and pine, as if the world itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold inside. Evelyn Carter sat in the back of the limousine with her gloved hands knotted tightly in her lap, the delicate lace of her wedding gown pressing into her wrists. She had never imagined that her first night as a bride would feel like a funeral procession. Yet every passing second confirmed the truth that this marriage was not born of love or choice but of duty, debt, and her family's desperate attempt to survive. At only 22, she should have been chasing dreams instead of walking into nightmares. When the heavy iron gates opened and the car crept along the winding driveway, Evelyn's heart slammed against her ribs with dread. The mansion rose before her like a cathedral carved from shadows, its towers looming high, its windows reflecting no light, its walls whispering secrets too dark to survive daylight. The driver opened her door, but she hesitated, her legs trembling beneath the weight of satin. She stepped down, the sharp click of her heels echoing against the marble stairs as thunder cracked overhead, the sky itself warning her to turn back. Inside, the corridors glowed dimly with sconces casting weak amber across stern portraits of long-dead ancestors. Every footstep felt intrusive and unwelcome, as though the house itself resented her presence. 2 maids rushed past carrying folded linens, their heads bent close in hushed whispers, and Evelyn caught just enough of their words to wound her deeply. He broke his last wife on their wedding night. The phrase pierced her composure like glass and froze her in place. She clutched the banister as her mind spun with questions she dared not voice. Was it rumor, exaggeration, or cruel truth? She wanted to confront them, to demand clarity. But they had already vanished, leaving her alone with the echo of their warning. The words repeated in her head, heavy and relentless, broke his last wife. Evelyn had heard enough about Damien Whitmore to know his cold reputation was no fabrication. Newspapers called him the Ice King. Employees described him as ruthless and efficient, a man without warmth. Yet still she had agreed, or rather been forced to agree, to bind herself to him, because her father had begged, because debts had mounted too high, because this union was the only way to save the Carter family's crumbling company. Her breath snagged in her chest when she reached the master suite door. It loomed tall carved oak, more like the entrance to a tomb than a bedroom. She swallowed hard and pushed it open. The room was grand but sterile, decorated in gray and black with a fire flickering weakly in the hearth. A crystal chandelier glittered overhead, mocking her dread. And then she saw him. Damien Whitmore stood near the fireplace, his broad shoulders outlined by firelight, his black suit jacket unbuttoned, his tie discarded, yet nothing about his posture suggested ease. He looked carved from marble, with a severe jawline, hair dark as ink and eyes sharp enough to slice through her trembling defenses. When his gaze landed on her, Evelyn felt every fragile wall inside her collapse. For a heartbeat, silence ruled the room as flames crackled, and the storm whispered against the glass, while her own pulse thundered in her ears. Then he spoke. "You're trembling. Good. Fear keeps people honest." His words struck harder than the maid's warning. Honest. What honesty could she offer when she was here only as a pawn in a deal struck between men? She wanted to insist she wasn't afraid, but her lips refused to move. Damien watched her with an unreadable expression, one hand sliding into his pocket, the other resting casually on the mantel, as though he had all the time in the world to watch her squirm. Evelyn forced herself forward, her gown sweeping across the polished floor, its long train trailing like the tether of a prisoner. She fought to steady her voice, though it cracked despite her effort. "I came because my family needed me to." It was pitiful, but it was the only truth she had. Damien tilted his head slightly, a gesture that might have been curiosity or disdain, and his silence pressed against her like a weight until she thought she might suffocate. Sparks from the fire leapt upward like frightened birds as her knees threatened to buckle, but she locked them straight. She would not fall, not tonight, not in front of him. The distance between them was only a few steps, yet it felt like a chasm. She clutched the edge of her veil, twisting the fabric between her fingers. She thought of her mother, gone too soon, who had once told her that fear could be fought by standing tall. But her mother had never faced a man like Damien Whitmore. Evelyn forced herself to meet his gaze, his eyes burning like frozen steel. "Do you expect me to fear you?" she asked, her voice trembling despite the courage she tried to summon. A faint curve touched his lips, not a smile but something colder. Expectation is irrelevant, he replied. Fear is instinct. You already feel it. The words dropped into her stomach like stones. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. She wanted to run, to vanish into the storm outside, but her father's pleading voice chained her here. This was duty, this was her cage, and Damian Whitmore was the man who locked the door. The fire snapped, its light flashing across his face. And for a moment Evelyn thought she saw something human flicker there. A shadow of weariness, but it vanished quickly, replaced by the mask of perfect control. He lifted a crystal glass from the table and sipped amber liquor without breaking eye contact. Evelyn's throat went dry, her palms slick inside her silk gloves, yet she forced herself to take another step, then another, until she stood only a few feet away. The flames painted his features in shifting gold and shadow, making him appear both angelic and demonic. He set down the glass and spoke again, softer but no less piercing. You entered my house knowing who I am. Don't pretend surprise when I am exactly that. Her lips parted, but no answer came. The horror wasn't only in his words, it was in the truth behind them. She was no longer Evelyn Carter, the girl with sketchbooks and hidden dreams. She was Mrs. Whitmore, bride to a man colder than stone, bound by vows spoken beneath chandeliers and the crushing weight of obligation. Outside the storm raged, lightning split the sky. Thunder rolled like a drumbeat of warning, and inside Evelyn stood trembling at the edge of her first night, swallowed whole by the man the world called the Ice King. Evelyn stood frozen in the firelit room, her pulse hammering in her ears as Damian Whitmore's words echoed like a curse. Fear keeps people honest. The walls of the suite felt as though they were closing in, pressing against her skin until every breath was a battle. This was the night she had dreaded since the engagement had been announced, the night that whispered through every shadow of her mind. Her father had insisted it was necessary. Her siblings had looked away, and now here she was, trapped with the man the world called the Ice King. She expected him to advance, to claim his rights, to treat her as nothing more than a transaction fulfilled. Her breath shook as he set down the glass, the ice clinking softly against crystal, and then he turned toward her. Each step he took was deliberate, his gaze locked to hers, and Evelyn braced herself as though for impact. Her fingers clenched the veil so tightly the lace nearly tore, her heartbeat matching the roar of the storm outside. Louder, faster, building toward something inevitable. Damian stopped only inches from her, his presence overwhelming. She closed her eyes, the weight of expectation pressing down like stone. But instead of the cruelty she feared, she felt something startling. Warmth, the soft brush of fabric over her shoulders. Her eyes flew open in shock. Damian had slipped his jacket from his body and draped it gently across her trembling frame. He wasn't reaching for her as she had imagined. Instead, he was covering her, shielding her from the chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The fire crackled louder as if mocking her confusion. His hands lingered only long enough to settle the coat around her before falling back to his sides. He hadn't touched her skin, he hadn't demanded anything. He only looked at her, his expression unreadable as though weighing something silently. Evelyn struggled to breathe, her words tangling on her tongue. I don't understand, she whispered. His reply was calm, deliberate, spoken with the authority of a man who never wasted words. Everyone believes this night belongs to me, he said, his voice carrying low and steady, vibrating against the walls. They are wrong. It belongs to you. You set the rules here. Her lips parted in disbelief. She had prepared herself for humiliation, for pain, for the cold inevitability of being claimed by a man she did not know. What she had not prepared for was choice. The storm rattled the windows, but inside the room time slowed. She searched his face for cruelty, for mockery, for any sign that this was a trick. Instead, she found only the steel of restraint, the discipline of a man used to controlling not just his empire but himself. He turned away before she could respond, moving to the mantel and reaching out to pinch the flame of a candle between his fingers. The light sputtered and died, shadows stretching across the suite. One by one, he extinguished them until the room glowed only with the fire and the hearth. The intimacy of the gesture unsettled her more than any threat could have. Evelyn pulled the jacket closer, inhaling the faint scent of cedar and smoke clinging to the fabric. Her mind reeled. Was this another form of control? An illusion of power meant to disarm her, or was it something else entirely? He turned back, his figure framed in the glow of the fire, his features softened by shadow. His eyes found hers again, piercing but no longer cruel. "You will not be touched tonight," he said, each word measured and unshakable. "Not until you want me to." Evelyn swayed as if the floor beneath her had shifted. The jacket weighed heavy on her shoulders, yet she felt lighter than she had since the vows were spoken. She could hardly process the contradiction. This man, painted by the world as ruthless, feared by employees and hated by rivals, had just offered her something no one else in her life ever had: control, choice, respect. For a long moment she could not speak. The storm outside filled the silence, rain drumming against the glass as she finally found her voice, faint and uneven. "Why?" she asked. It was the only question that mattered. Damien's jaw tightened, his gaze unwavering. "Because fear may keep people honest," he said, softer than before, "but respect keeps them whole. I will not break what is not mine to break." Her chest constricted, her breath catching on a sob she refused to release. She wanted to believe him, to trust that beneath the ice there was something human. But trust was dangerous, and she had already surrendered too much by standing here. Yet her heart, traitorous and desperate, whispered that perhaps the horror she had been promised was not the horror she would receive. Damien stepped back, granting her space, his presence receding like the tide. He lifted his crystal glass once more, sipping quietly as though their exchange was complete, as though he had already said all that needed to be said. Evelyn remained rooted to the floor, her body trembling, her mind racing. The whispers of the maids returned, colliding with his words. "He broke his last wife against you, set the rules here. Two truths impossible to reconcile." She clutched the jacket tighter, grounding herself in its warmth. She realized with startling clarity that the man before her was not the monster she had been led to fear, nor the savior she secretly longed for. He was something more dangerous. He was unpredictable. The storm thundered again, rattling the windows. Evelyn took a cautious step back, retreating toward the edge of the bed, her thoughts a chaos of fear and fragile hope. The firelight danced across Damien's profile as he stared into the flames, his expression unreadable. And for the first time that night, she wondered if the true horror lay not in the man himself, but in the walls they both carried within. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm that felt less like marriage and more like coexisting with a ghost. Evelyn moved through the endless corridors of the Whitmore estate, her footsteps softened by Persian rugs, her presence absorbed by walls that seemed to have witnessed centuries of secrets. Damien was both there and not there, his existence marked by the faint click of polished shoes on marble, the low murmur of phone calls carried out behind closed doors, and the lingering scent of expensive cologne long after he had left a room. They spoke little, and when they did, his words were clipped. Efficient, never careless. At breakfast, he sat at the far end of a long mahogany table, the silence stretching wider than the polished wood between them. He read the financial section of the newspaper while she stirred her tea, the clink of silver spoon against porcelain the only sound. Sometimes she glanced up, searching for a trace of the man who had wrapped her in his jacket on their wedding night, the man who had extinguished the candles as though sparing her from something darker. But each time his eyes lifted, they revealed nothing but the cold restraint of the Ice King, and he would return to his paper without a word. At night she lay awake in the vast bed, listening for footsteps that never came. The door to his adjoining chamber remained firmly closed. The staff moved around her with polite precision, their expressions betraying nothing, but Evelyn noticed things that contradicted his icy reputation. Every evening when she left her study, the hall light outside was switched on, though she had never turned it herself. When she struggled to move a heavy chair in the library, she discovered the next morning it had already been adjusted to her height. And though their dinners were silent, she realized her favorite dishes began appearing more often than chance could explain. It unsettled her to think that perhaps Damien noticed far more about her than he allowed her to see. One rainy afternoon, she wandered into the music room, her fingers brushing the dust from ivory keys of the grand piano. She hesitated before pressing a note, the sound trembling through the air like a memory too fragile to hold. When she looked up, she caught sight of him leaning in the doorway, silent, watching. He did not interrupt, did not comment. He inclined his head once, a subtle acknowledgement, then vanished as quietly as he had come. The moment left her shaken, as though he had glimpsed a part of her no one else had cared to see. Life with Damien became a study in contradictions. He was cold yet considerate, absent yet ever present, silent yet watchful. Evelyn began to realize that she had not been given a husband but a puzzle, each piece deepening her curiosity instead of satisfying it. Her fear had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something more complex. A restless need to understand the man who had given her power she had not expected, and distance she had never requested. The mansion itself mirrored their strange bond. Its halls were vast and intimidating, yet small details revealed unexpected warmth. Fresh flowers appeared in the vases of the drawing room each week, their colors bright against muted walls. The garden beneath her window was tended daily, roses pruned with precise care. Even the library shelves bore signs of use, certain volumes worn from repeated handling. She wondered which books were his, which belonged to his late mother, and which were simply remnants of a lineage no one remembered. Though he remained elusive, she began to sense a quiet protectiveness in the way he moved around her life. Once, when she attempted to carry a tray of tea herself, a butler rushed forward nervously, whispering that Mr. Whitmore had ordered she was never to lift more than she wished. Another time, when she mentioned casually that the estate felt drafty, the following night she found a new blanket folded neatly at the foot of her bed, heavier and warmer than the last. Evelyn lay beneath it that evening, staring at the ceiling, torn between gratitude and frustration. Gratitude because these small gestures proved he cared, frustration because he refused to let her see it openly. What was he hiding? What did he fear? That night she dreamed again of the storm on their wedding evening, of his voice both cold and soothing telling her, "You set the rules here." She awoke before dawn, her hand clutching the blanket he had chosen. The faint glow of the hallway light filtered through the crack in the door, left on once again, steady as a promise she had never asked for. Evelyn closed her eyes and realized she was no longer certain who Damien Whitmore truly was, stranger, protector, enemy, or something else entirely. The question consumed her more with each passing day, and though silence surrounded them, her heart whispered that the answer would not come in what he said, but in what he did. Evelyn's curiosity sharpened into something heavier the morning she asked the driver to take her into the city, desperate to escape the suffocating silence of the Whitmore estate. Though he hesitated, he obeyed, and the car stopped outside a private hospital where Damien's name was engraved on the donor plaque near the entrance. Evelyn entered quietly, half hidden beneath a scarf, and followed the antiseptic corridor lined with hushed voices and the faint scent of disinfectant. At the end of the hall she froze. There sat the man the world knew as the Ice King, not at the head of a boardroom table but beside a frail woman in a wheelchair. His hand rested gently over hers as he coaxed a fleeting smile from eyes clouded by confusion. The woman muttered broken words, her memory fractured by illness, but Damien listened intently, his voice low and patient, as though every syllable mattered. Evelyn's chest tightened at the sight. This was not the ruthless figure painted in headlines, but a son, clinging to the last threads of family. She turned away before he noticed her, her heart rattled by the crack she had just seen in his armor. Later that week, the rain slicked the marble steps of the estate. Evelyn, distracted by her thoughts, slipped, and before she could hit the ground, strong arms caught her. Damien's reflex was swift, his usually composed face flashing with raw fear. For an instant she was pressed against him, her breath tangled with his eyes wide not with coldness but with concern. For her. He steadied her carefully before letting go, his jaw tightening as though to mask the moment. "You should be more careful," he muttered. But his tone carried worry disguised as irritation. Evelyn's knees trembled, not from the fall but from the revelation that beneath his polished exterior, Damien was capable of care. That night she replayed the moment endlessly, the way his hands had lingered longer than necessary, the way his eyes had softened before he forced them hard again. She told herself it was instinct, reflex, nothing more, but the warmth it left in her chest betrayed her reasoning. Days bled into nights, and each time she observed him, new fissures in the ice appeared. A pause in his stride when she laughed unexpectedly at a book, a quiet sigh when he thought he was alone in his study, the faintest twitch of his lips when she thanked a servant by name. These glimpses were fleeting, vanishing the instant she looked directly at him, but they were real. One evening she wandered into the kitchen long after dinner and was startled to find Damien there. Sleeves rolled up as he poured himself a glass of water, they stood in silence, two strangers bound by vows but divided by walls. She reached for a glass, fumbled, and it slipped from her hand, but before it could shatter, he caught it with startling speed, his hand brushing hers. Electricity sparked at the brief contact, undeniable and sharp. She whispered a soft thank you, her cheeks burning, and he only nodded before leaving. The echo of that touch lingered long after his footsteps had faded. Evelyn began to see the contradiction in every act of distance he showed. He was always near enough to notice, to protect, to intervene, yet far enough to deny the truth of his presence. He was a man fighting himself, and in that battle she saw not cruelty but pain. One night, restless, she wandered the halls and found herself outside his study. The door was slightly ajar, and inside Damien sat at his desk with his head bowed, his hand pressed to his temple. Papers lay scattered across the surface, his tie loosened, his posture stripped of the unshakable power he wore in public. He looked human, exhausted, vulnerable. She almost stepped inside, almost reached out to him, but fear held her still. She watched in silence until he straightened, sliding the mask back into place as he closed the door with finality. Evelyn retreated to her room, her chest aching with a strange mixture of pity and longing. The horror she had expected on her wedding night had not come. Instead, something far more disorienting had taken its place. The slow realization that the coldest man she had ever known carried warmth he refused to release. It unsettled her more than cruelty ever could because it made her hope, and hope, Evelyn knew, was more dangerous than fear. The transformation began not with words but with something as simple as food. One Saturday afternoon, Evelyn wandered restlessly through the garden when Damien appeared without warning. He did not ask what troubled her, only suggested they take a drive. Curiosity overpowered hesitation, and soon she sat beside him in the passenger seat of his vintage Mustang, the engine purring with restrained power as the city blurred past in streaks of sunlight and shadow. She expected him to take her to a private restaurant or some grand dining hall, but instead he parked along a crowded street filled with food trucks and laughter. The scent of grilled cheese and roasted peppers drifted through the air as college students and families balanced paper plates on their laps. Damien stepped out of the car, his presence commanding even in this casual setting, and when Evelyn hesitated, he circled around to open her door himself, his hand steady as he offered it to her. She placed her palm in his, surprised at the warmth, and followed him to a bright red truck painted with cartoon flames. He ordered 2 sandwiches and lemonades in a voice that, for once, held casual ease. They stood together on the curb, eating like ordinary people, melted cheese stretching in gooey strings. When a piece dripped onto his sleeve, Evelyn laughed, the sound spilling out unguarded, startling her with its freedom. Damien froze for a fraction of a second, then allowed the corner of his mouth to twitch upward in something dangerously close to a smile. That fleeting crack in his mask meant more to her than any jewel could. After that day, small rituals began to grow between them. He discovered she loved sunsets, and one evening he drove her to the cliffs above the ocean. They sat on the hood of the Mustang as the salt air tangled her hair, and the horizon burned with orange and violet flames. He said nothing, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was companionable, as though both understood that some beauty required no words. Another time she found a Polaroid camera left on her desk. No note attached, but the handwriting on the box unmistakably his. A single phrase was scrawled across it: "Capture what matters." She smiled softly, touched by the unexpected gift, and began snapping photos of everything. The rose garden, the stray cat that prowled the estate, even Damien himself when he least expected it. Once she dared to capture him with his tie undone, hair slightly mussed, eyes distant in thought. When she showed him the picture, he studied it longer than she expected, as if unaccustomed to seeing himself unguarded. Meals slowly shifted from the vast dining table to the smaller breakfast room, where they sometimes sat side by side. Once she attempted to cook pancakes, a disaster that left flour scattered across counters and batter dripping down the stove. Damien walked in mid-chaos, his eyebrows lifting at the sight. Instead of scolding her, he rolled up his sleeves and joined in, flipping pancakes with surprising skill. They laughed together at the lopsided results, and Evelyn realized joy could bloom even in burnt edges and sticky counters. On a quiet Sunday, she asked about his favorite music, expecting silence, but he surprised her by turning on an old record player. Soft jazz filled the study, trumpet notes curling like smoke. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, his features stripped of tension, and Evelyn sketched him quickly in her notebook. When he opened his eyes, he caught sight of the drawing and studied it. "You make me look kinder than I am," he said. She held his gaze and whispered, "Maybe you are kinder than you let yourself be." He said nothing, but something shifted in his eyes, a truth he could not quite hide. Bit by bit, the mansion changed. What had once felt like a cage began to take on the shape of a home, not because its walls softened, but because the space between them filled with moments of ordinary intimacy. Sometimes he would pass her in the hall and hand her a book with a simple, "You might like this." Sometimes she would slip a Polaroid into his briefcase, a candid reminder that life was more than mergers and meetings. Her laughter returned, less foreign, and her heart felt lighter than it had since the wedding vows. Yet beneath the warmth lingered questions she dared not ask. Why had he given her choice that first night? Why did he shield her in shadows but never step fully into the light with her? The answers remained locked behind his guarded expression, but each day the cracks in his eyes widened, and Evelyn could not help but believe that one day the facade might shatter completely. As she lay in bed one night, flipping through Polaroids of sunsets, burnt pancakes and half smiles, she realized the truth. What terrified her on her wedding night had not been horror at all. It had been the possibility of hope. And hope, she thought, was more dangerous than fear, because hope demanded she keep reaching for more. The evening that shifted everything began with a storm that kept Evelyn awake long after midnight. Rain lashed against the windows of her bedroom, thunder rolling like distant drums. But it wasn't the weather that unsettled her most. It was the silence inside the house. The Whitmore estate was rarely still, always filled with the careful footsteps of staff and the sharp presence of Damien. But tonight it felt suspended in uneasy stillness. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, Evelyn wandered into the dim hallway, her feet carrying her toward the faint light spilling from beneath the study door. She hesitated, then pushed it open just enough to see him. Damien sat at his desk, tie loosened, head bowed into his hands, papers scattered across the wood. The fire in the hearth reduced to embers. He didn't look like the Ice King in that moment. He looked like a man burdened by ghosts. Evelyn stepped inside quietly. The floor creaked and his head lifted, eyes narrowing for an instant before softening when he recognized her. "Couldn't sleep?" His voice was rough, weary. She shook her head and moved closer, unsure if she was intruding but unwilling to retreat. They sat in silence, the storm outside filling the space between them, until she finally whispered, "I used to draw when I couldn't sleep. It was my escape." Damien's gaze lingered, inviting her to go on, and so she did. She spoke of her childhood, of long nights in a small apartment above her father's failing store, of sketchbooks filled with dreams she could never afford to chase. She told him about her mother's laughter that had once filled their home, and how illness had taken it away, leaving silence that never healed. Her voice cracked when she admitted she had agreed to this marriage not only for duty, but because she had believed, foolishly perhaps, that love might still find her, even in the strangest places. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes sharp as if he was storing every word she offered him. When she finished, she expected dismissal or mockery, but instead he leaned back slowly, exhaling as though releasing years of restraint. "I never believed in escape," he said, his voice low, steady, tinged with something she had never heard from him before. "When I was a boy, my father taught me that weakness invites ruin. My mother tried to shield me, but he broke her spirit until she left. I told myself I didn't care, that I didn't need her. But the truth is, I never forgave myself for not protecting her." Evelyn's breath caught. His words were raw, unguarded, carved from wounds buried deep. His hands clenched on the armrests of his chair, knuckles white as though even memory demanded control. "I learned to survive by freezing everything inside," he continued. "Feel nothing, want nothing. Build an empire and no one can hurt you." His voice faltered, and she realized she was witnessing a confession he had never shared with anyone. Tentatively, she reached across the desk and placed her hand over his. He stiffened at the contact, muscles tensing, but he didn't pull away. His eyes dropped to her hand, delicate against his scarred knuckles, and for once he allowed silence to stretch between them without building walls. "You are not weak for feeling," Evelyn whispered. "You are human." His jaw tightened as though the word itself was foreign. "And if being human means losing everything?" Bitterness laced his tone. She held his gaze, her voice steadier than she felt. Then at least you lived. At least you loved. Something fractured in his expression, a vulnerability he tried to suppress but could not completely conceal. Lightning illuminated the room, showing him younger, less a ruthless titan and more a man who had carried too much for too long. Evelyn squeezed his hand gently, offering him the reassurance she wished someone had once given him. His eyes closed briefly, and when they opened, there was a softness she had never seen before. "You think love is enough," he murmured. "I think love is the only thing that ever was," she replied softly. The words hung between them, fragile yet unyielding. Neither spoke again, but something shifted in the room. The storm raged outside, yet inside the study a fragile peace settled. They sat together until the fire died completely, her hand still over his, their silence no longer a barrier but a bond. Later, when Evelyn returned to her room, her heart ached with both hope and fear. She knew now that the horror of her wedding night had never been Damien himself, but the walls he had built, and she knew also that those walls were beginning to crack. She wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders, hearing his confession replay in her mind, and for the first time since the vows had been spoken, she allowed herself to believe that buried beneath the frost, Damien Whitmore might carry a heart capable of warmth. The days that followed their midnight confessions carried a different weight. The silence between Evelyn and Damien was no longer suffocating, but threaded with unspoken understanding. She caught him watching her sometimes, his eyes less guarded, and when she smiled he did not turn away as quickly. Yet just as warmth began to bloom, reality returned in the form of Richard Whitmore. He arrived without warning one afternoon, his presence filling the estate like a storm cloud. His tailored suit was immaculate, his cane more for theatrics than necessity, and his gaze sharp enough to cut marble. Evelyn stood at the top of the staircase when he entered, and when their eyes met for a fleeting moment she saw nothing but calculation. He dismissed her with a glance and turned to his son. Damien's posture stiffened, the mask of the Ice King snapping back into place as father and son retreated into the study. The heavy door closed, sealing Evelyn in the hall outside with only muffled voices to wound her. Richard's tone was cold, commanding. "You forget yourself, Damien. Marriage is not about sentiment, it is about leverage. That girl is nothing more than a pawn. Do not confuse convenience with affection." Damien's response was lower, a growl beneath his words. "She is my wife." Richard scoffed, his laughter echoing through the wood panels. "Your wife is a tool. You do not marry for love, you marry for power. And if you let emotion cloud your judgment, I will remind you how quickly pawns can be removed from the board." Evelyn's chest constricted, each word stabbing like a blade. She pressed her hand against the door, fighting tears, knowing she should not be listening but unable to move. Richard's threat was unmistakable. If Damien allowed himself to care, Evelyn would pay the price. She staggered back when the voices fell silent, retreating to her room before they emerged. There she collapsed onto the bed, clutching the Polaroids she had begun to treasure. One showed Damien by the food truck, half smiling as he held a sandwich. Her tears blurred the image until it smeared into nothing but color. She had thought she was breaking through his walls, that love might take root in barren ground. But Richard's words were a brutal reminder that she was never meant to matter. She was currency, payment for her father's debts, a means to an end. That evening, Damien entered her room. He looked composed as always, but she noticed the tension in his jaw, the faint crease between his brows. "You should rest," he said simply. Evelyn forced her voice to remain steady. "Am I just leverage to you?" The question sliced through the air like lightning. His eyes darkened, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then softly, "That is what my father wants you to be." It was not an answer, yet it was. Her throat ached as she whispered, "And what do you want?" He hesitated, his expression torn by a war he refused to voice. Finally he turned away, his back rigid. "What I want is irrelevant." The words gutted her more than cruelty ever could. Tears stung her eyes as she whispered, "I thought I saw something real in you." Damien froze but did not face her. Instead he left the room and closed the door with quiet finality. Evelyn sank to the floor, her body trembling, Richard's threats echoing in her head, and Damien's silence cutting deeper than any words. She had seen the cracks in his ice, had glimpsed the warmth he kept hidden, but now she feared it was warmth that would never be hers. The days that followed passed in a blur of avoidance. Damien buried himself in work, rarely leaving the study. When he did appear, his presence was cold, polite, untouchable. Evelyn drifted through the estate aimlessly, her hope withering under the weight of doubt. Every glance at the Polaroids hurt, every memory of laughter tainted by the reminder that she was nothing more than a pawn in someone else's game. One evening she found herself in the music room again, her fingers trembling on the piano keys. She played softly, a melody her mother once sang, the notes breaking with her tears. She sensed Damien in the doorway but did not stop. When the final chord faded, she whispered without turning, "I will not be your father's pawn." The silence stretched until his voice finally came, filled with both anger and despair. "You don't understand the danger." She turned, eyes fierce through her tears. "Then make me understand or let me go." His face was unreadable, but she saw the war raging inside him. He wanted to protect her, yet he could not admit he cared. And in that refusal lay her answer. She rose from the piano, wiped her eyes, and whispered, "If you cannot choose me over him, then I will choose myself." Her footsteps echoed through the hall as she left, each one pulling her farther from the fragile hope she had built. Damien remained standing in the music room, the mask of the Ice King back in place, but beneath it his heart was breaking too. The confrontation with Richard left Evelyn hollow. The mansion that had begun to feel less like a cage and more like a home now suffocated her with every echo of her footsteps. She could not erase Richard's words from her mind, nor could she forget Damien's refusal to answer when she asked what he truly wanted. Days stretched into weeks of half-spoken sentences and cold nods across the dining table. Damien buried himself in work, his study door locked more often than not. When he emerged, his presence was polished and distant, as if the confessions he had given her that stormy night had never been spoken at all. At first, Evelyn tried to reach him. She waited in the music room with her Polaroid camera, hoping he would step inside. She cooked small meals in the kitchen, praying he might join her. But he never came. Each rejection cut deeper until she stopped trying altogether. The hope she had nurtured with food trucks, sunsets, and laughter over burnt pancakes shriveled into bitterness. One night, unable to hold back her frustration, she confronted him in the hallway. Her voice trembled with both rage and despair. "I won't be a pawn in your father's game." Damien froze, his jaw tightening, his eyes flashing with something unspoken, but he did not argue. He only said, "You are safer if you stay." The words shattered her. Safer was not love. Safer was not choice. Safer was simply another cage wrapped in gilded bars. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Then I'd rather risk danger than live like this." She walked past him, her gown brushing his suit, the distance between them widening with every step. He didn't follow. His fists clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms, but he stood still as stone. Evelyn realized then that he would not fight for her, whether out of fear for her safety or fear of his father's wrath. And the result was the same. She was alone. The next morning she packed a small suitcase, carefully placing her Polaroids inside. The roses in the garden swayed gently in the breeze as she descended the marble steps, her heart heavy but resolute. The driver looked startled when she told him to take her to the train station, but he obeyed. Evelyn did not look back at the mansion. She could not bear to imagine Damien standing at a window watching her leave, doing nothing to stop her. The city was loud, chaotic, and indifferent, but in its noise she found a strange sense of freedom. She rented a small apartment near the art district, its walls bare and humble, nothing like the cavernous Whitmore estate. For the first time in months she breathed without feeling the weight of expectation pressing down on her chest. Yet even in independence, Damien haunted her. Every time she picked up a pencil, her sketches turned into his profile, the crease in his brow, the rare softness of his half-smile. She tore the pages from her notebook in frustration, scattering them across the floor, but the images returned again and again. Nights were the worst. She lay awake clutching the Polaroid camera, flipping through the photos she had taken. His laugh caught mid-bite at the food truck, his gaze fixed on the horizon at the cliffs, the blurred candid of him pouring coffee in the kitchen. Each picture was a reminder of what could have been if only he had chosen differently. She told herself she hated him, told herself she was better off without him, but the ache in her chest betrayed her. Across town, Damien sat alone in his study, the fire burning low. Papers lay untouched, business forgotten. his thoughts consumed by the emptiness Evelyn had left behind. He had watched her departure from an upper window, unseen, every instinct screaming to run after her, but his father's warning echoed in his head. Pawns can be removed. He had convinced himself that letting her go would keep her safe, but the silence hollowed him until even victory tasted of ash. He poured whiskey into a glass but could not bring himself to drink. The burn in his chest was greater than any liquor could numb. He opened a drawer and found the Polaroid she had once slipped into his briefcase, a photo of the rose garden in bloom. His vision blurred as he stared at it, his fingers trembling. For the first time in years, Damien admitted to himself that he was afraid, not of his father, not of failure, but of losing the only person who had ever truly seen him. And yet he had let her go. Evelyn pressed her forehead against the cool window pane of her tiny apartment as rain fell outside. Damien hunched in his grand study beneath the weight of his choices. Two people separated by silence, both pretending that distance meant safety, when the truth was far crueler. Distance was the most dangerous thing of all. The night it all came crashing down began with a phone call Evelyn never expected. She was leaving her small apartment, her raincoat pulled tight against the drizzle, when her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. A clipped voice warned her not to go near the main street by the train station. The line went dead before she could respond. Unease coiled in her stomach and she changed her path. But she hadn't gone far when two men in dark suits stepped from the shadows of an alley. Their words were sharp and cold, their presence unmistakably tied to Richard Whitmore. "You should have stayed in your cage," one hissed. Before she could cry out, they shoved her back, her body slamming against slick pavement as fear exploded inside her chest. The world spun, then the roar of an engine tore through the rain. Headlights cut the darkness as a black Mustang screeched to a halt. Damien. He emerged like a storm given flesh, fists colliding with the men before Evelyn could even blink. Fury rolled off him raw and unrestrained, his usually composed face fractured by fear. The attackers scrambled into the night, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Damien standing there, his chest heaving, rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. He turned to Evelyn, his eyes wild, his voice breaking. "I thought fear would protect me," he said, breath ragged. "But losing you is the only real horror." Her body trembled, partly from the attack and partly from the force of his words. He crossed the distance in 2 strides, cupping her face with hands that shook with desperation. She stared up at him, rain and tears mingling on her skin, her heart cracking open at last. "You left me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You let me believe I didn't matter." His forehead pressed against hers, his voice spilling out like a dam breaking. "I thought pushing you away would keep you safe. My father made threats and I believed him. But the truth is I was a coward. Too afraid of losing control. Too afraid of needing someone. You are not leverage, you are not a pawn. You are everything." The rain fell harder, thunder crashing above them, but in that narrow alley the world shrank to just the two of them. Evelyn's sobs turned into broken laughter as she clutched at his jacket. "I don't need protection from you," she cried. "I need the truth. I need you." His answer was not words but a kiss, fierce, unrestrained, desperate. Years of ice shattered in that moment. It was not graceful, it was not careful, but it was real. When they broke apart, foreheads pressed together, his voice came in a whisper. "I will fight him. I will fight anyone who tries to take you from me." She searched his eyes and found no mask, no armor, only raw honesty. "And I will not run again," she said. The alley glistened with rain and light, water cascading around them like a curtain, but they stood rooted, unshaken. Damien gathered her into his arms, lifting her as though she weighed nothing, carrying her to the car. She did not protest. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the frantic rhythm of his heart, and for once it matched her own. The drive back to the estate was silent, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two souls who had finally confessed the truth, who no longer needed to fill the air with lies. When they arrived, Evelyn looked at the looming mansion and felt no fear. The house had not changed, but she was no longer facing it alone. Damien's hand never left hers as he guided her inside, the fire in the great hall roaring to life. "This ends tonight," he said firmly. His voice was no longer cold, no longer the detached tone of the Ice King, but the steady promise of a man who had chosen love over fear. For Evelyn, the horror of her wedding night seemed like a memory from another life. What had once been dread had transformed into something far more dangerous and far more precious. Hope. The fire in the great hall burned high, shadows dancing across marble as Damien led Evelyn forward with a steadiness that surprised even him. He had lived his entire life behind walls of control, silence, and ice. Yet tonight those walls had cracked beyond repair. Evelyn stood before him, her hair damp from the storm, her eyes luminous with both fear and hope. He reached for her hand, his rough fingers trembling as they enclosed hers, and his voice carried more weight than the vows spoken at their wedding. I almost lost you because I thought distance was protection. I almost destroyed us because I thought love was weakness. But I was wrong. You are not a pawn. You are my choice, my heart, my beginning. Her breath caught, her hand rising to his cheek, tracing the stubble there with tenderness that made his chest ache. I was afraid of this night, she admitted softly. Afraid of you, afraid of myself, afraid of the world. But I'm not afraid anymore. Not if it's with you. The admission stripped the air of every barrier, leaving only truth. Damien bent his head and kissed her slowly, reverently as though memorizing the shape of her lips. The kiss deepened, carrying apology and promise, desperation and release. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers as he whispered the only question that mattered. Are you sure? Her eyes held his without wavering, her voice steady. Yes. With careful hands, he led her into the bedroom, extinguishing lamps until only the flicker of firelight and the soft glow of candles remained. He guided her as if she were made of glass, not from fear of breaking her, but from reverence. She shed her fear with each piece of fabric, her heart pounding with anticipation, not dread. His lips brushed her forehead, her temples, her hands, never rushing, never demanding, waiting for her to guide the moment. When at last she pulled him closer, the final barriers fell. Their first night together was not marked by cruelty or conquest, but by healing. There was no fear, only the quiet miracle of two souls choosing each other where pain once reigned. Hours later, when the fire burned low, they lay entangled beneath the sheets, her head against his chest, his arm around her in protective silence. Evelyn whispered, I was afraid of this night until you. Damien pressed a kiss to her hair, his voice husky. Love was never the horror. It was the cure. Sleep came slowly, tender and unbroken. The following days unfolded differently. Damien no longer retreated behind walls, and Evelyn no longer shrank into corners. They moved through the house together, sometimes in laughter, sometimes in quiet companionship. But they both knew the battle was not yet over. Richard Whitmore still loomed like a shadow over every tender moment. One evening, Damien summoned his father to the estate. Evelyn sat beside him in the great hall, her hand firmly in his as Richard entered, his air of disdain filling the room. So, Richard said coldly, you have chosen defiance. Do you truly believe you can throw away everything I built for the sake of a girl? Damien rose, towering but calm, his voice steady as steel. You built an empire of fear. I will build one of respect. If that means losing your blessing, so be it. Richard sneered, his eyes flicking to Evelyn. She will drag you down. Before Damien could respond, Evelyn spoke, her voice unwavering. No. He rises because he finally has something worth fighting for. The silence that followed was thick. Richard's gaze hardened, but for the first time he seemed to see not just his son, but the woman who refused to cower. With a bitter shake of his head, he turned away. Then do as you will, but do not expect forgiveness when it crumbles. He left without ceremony, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Evelyn exhaled shakily, her heart pounding, but Damien squeezed her hand and met her eyes with quiet certainty. We have already won, he said. 3 months later, the estate was transformed not by chandeliers or marble, but by flowers, ribbons, and music. Friends gathered in the garden, laughter echoing through the air. Evelyn wore a simple gown, her hair loose, her smile radiant. Damien stood beside her in rolled-up sleeves, no tie, looking more handsome than any polished suit had ever made him. Their ceremony was intimate, filled with sincerity and joy. When he slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembled, but his voice did not. I vow to choose you every day, Not because of duty, not because of expectation, but because life without you is no life at all. Her eyes shimmered as she whispered in return, I vow to remind you that love is not weakness but strength. I vow to walk beside you even when the path is storm. Applause erupted, but the world shrank to just the two of them. Later, as the sun sank toward the horizon, Damien led her down a narrow path to the beach behind the estate. The sand was cool beneath their feet, waves whispering against the shore. He bent to remove her shoes and helped her step barefoot into the surf. She clung to his arm, unsteady, but he held her firm. I never thought I would feel this again, she whispered, tears filling her eyes. Every step I take, I want to take with you. His forehead pressed gently to hers as he murmured, and when you fall, I will be there. Always. Together they walked hand in hand, leaving footprints the tide could never erase. That night, as the stars bloomed above, Evelyn leaned against Damien and breathed in the salt-kissed air. She had entered this marriage trembling with fear, bound by obligation, convinced her life had ended. But in choosing each other, they had discovered that even in the darkest of nights, love could light a fire strong enough to chase away horror. Love was not the weakness Richard Whitmore had claimed, it was strength, courage, and freedom. And as the waves rolled endlessly toward the shore, Evelyn finally knew with unshakable certainty that her story was no longer one of survival. It was one of love.